Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Calvus, Consul 222, Proconsul 217 to 212 BCE. Scipio Calvus's career is often treated as being indistinguishable from that of his younger brother, and the combined efforts of the Scipio brothers are often viewed as little more than a preliminary to the brilliant achievements of Scipio Calvus's nephew, Scipio Africanus. However, while such a treatment is conducive to a neat narrative of how Rome won the Second Punic War, it is an oversimplification which does little justice to the highly impressive military achievements of Scipio Calvus. Not only was he personally responsible for nearly everything that he and his brother achieved as a unit, but it is also abundantly clear that Scipio Calvus was vastly more talented than Publius Scipio, at least in the arena of war. One of the key factors in Scipio Africanus' later conquest of Barcid Spain was the goodwill the Scipio brothers, especially Scipio Calvus, had earned among the leaders of the Celtiberian tribes. Scipio Calvus' achievements are impressive in both the narratives of Polybius and Livy, as he remains undefeated in the field until the bitter end. Polybius' account, which is generally preferred by scholars, makes the most sense. While I believe that Polybius' account is far more accurate, I will also furnish details from Livy's history, which may be improbable, not least because of some incredible geographical claims, but because it very much emphasizes the reality of Scipio Calvus' military skill. And perhaps more importantly, it makes for a hell of a story. While Scipio Calvus' descendants were not as prominent as his brother's heirs, the Scipio Nasica line that he founded through his son would also achieve high office and renown in the years to come. There may well have been a few families which could claim that their heritage was just distinguished as that of the Scipii, as they too were patricians. However, no other family in Rome, with the possible exception of the Fabii, could claim that their family had been as relevant for as long and claim that they had as much power as they did in the present when compared with the Scipii. The grandfather of the subject of this video is Lucius Cornelius Scipio Barbatus, and he was a legend. He was consul a couple of times, held the censorship, and was generally considered to be one of the more capable men in his day. His heyday was approximately the 290s, so while this was not quite recent history, it was recent enough that the name was very famous. The father of Gnaeus was Lucius Cornelius Scipio. By the standards of the Scipii, he actually was not terribly distinguished. He did serve as consul, but that was about it, and that shows you just how high the standards of his family truly were. Gnaeus' uncle, who shared his name, was Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Asina. Asina technically means female donkey, so in English that would be Jenny, but it makes a little more sense in English to call him the jackass, and that is clearly the kind of insult that the Romans were looking for when they assigned him that name. Interestingly enough, the descendants of Scipio Asina proudly bore the name Asina. I guess they just wore it as a badge of honor, and the idea was that the Romans who mocked them didn't know what they were talking about. But for those of you who don't know, Scipio Asina is famous for being a rather bad naval commander during the First Punic War. Gnaeus, that being the Gnaeus of this video, not the jackass, had a younger brother named Publius who was elected consul in 218. The two of them are the Scipio brothers, and their fates will be inextricably intertwined, starting in 218 and going to the end of their lives in 212. By the time that the two brothers are adults and are of office-holding age in the 220s, the Cornelii Scipii were arguably the most influential patrician family in Roman politics. A lot of modern scholars actually think they had more overall sway than the Fabii. There was something of a culture war in Rome at this time where the Fabii were more of the leaders of the traditionalists, the people who wanted to keep Roman culture pure, whereas the Scipii were much more open to Hellenistic influences and to studying Greek and sort of adopting more of the traditions of their neighbors. So there is that going on as well, but we don't have a ton of details about this, and it seems that this kind of internal Roman culture war, while it was going on, was kind of paused due to the war, and then it would pick up again in the 190s and beyond, and some of the major players at that point would be people such as Scipio Africanus, the nephew of the subject of this video, and also Cato the Elder on the other side. So it is possible that whole narrative was sort of retrojected into the 220s and 210s, but it is possible that this was already going on as the Romans were exposed to lots and lots of foreign influences by this point. Scipio Calvus had an eventful consulship, and in normal times this would have been probably his only real opportunity to prove himself as a commander. It was an opportunity that he made the most of, as we'll see. This opportunity first arose 3 years before he was elected in 225. That year in 225, when Scipio Calvus was in all likelihood serving as praetor, the Gauls decided to invade Etruria, one of the richest regions in Italy, and one of the chief areas of Roman power. This led to the Battle of Telamon that same year, where one of the Roman consuls died, but the Romans ultimately prevailed. The Romans then took the war against the Gauls to the north and fought them in their own homelands. You see the territories of the Boii and the Insubres, the Ligurians and others, and that is where the war will be fought for the next 3 years. In 224 and 223, the Romans were steadily winning victories and forcing the various tribes of the north to submit. By 222, Gallic morale was effectively broken, and the Gauls were suing for peace. However, the two consul-elects, Scipio Calvus and Marcus Claudius Marcellus, both of whom would later become renowned as military commanders, were pretty convinced that they could do a good job with the war and that they could win a good deal of renown. So because of that, they decided that it would be good to keep the war going for another year to win even more favorable terms. So that is what ended up happening. Unless they were pressed by the most dire military emergency, the Romans were not terribly influenced by the perceived military skill of the consuls they elected. But in 222, the Romans inadvertently elected a military dream team. Most of you are probably aware that Scipio Calvus and Marcellus would prove themselves to be two of the best generals of the entire Second Punic War. In 222, they got a good chance to test out their skills and show that they would be a force to be reckoned with when the war with Carthage came. Both consuls marched together against the Insubres and laid siege to the city of Ossory. This was one of the chief cities of the Insubres, but not their capital. The Insubres were very interested in relieving the siege, so they decided to attack Clastidium. This was a city that was in the territory of one of Rome's recently acquired allies. In order to prevent this people from breaking away and the war from expanding, Calvus decided to stay at Ossory to press the siege, while Marcellus marched out with a force to relieve Clastidium. There he won a victory, and for that effort he was later awarded a triumph. After the fall of Ossory, when Marcellus got back, Calvus then led the army up to Mediolanum. At this point he seems to have been in command. Perhaps they were together, or else all the events that we're about to discuss happened on Calvus's day of command. It's not entirely clear. And the idea was to advance on Mediolanum, which is today's Milan. But for whatever reason, Scipio Calvus decided the time wasn't right, so he started to fall back. The Insubres were emboldened, and they thought that the Romans were scared, so they launched a vicious attack on the Roman rearguard. This was a fraught situation. It almost became a military defeat. However, Scipio Calvus kept his head, and his rearguard did their duty. While they were holding the line, Scipio Calvus managed to reverse his column and get his front and middle units into the action, and eventually this resulted in a war-winning victory. It came at a high cost in terms of casualties, but he did inflict quite a few losses on the Insubres, and he broke their spirit. He managed to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. After their army was defeated, a lot of the warriors dispersed to the countryside, and he was then able to march to Mediolanum and take the city, where he accepted the formal surrender of the Insubres. This ended the war. Although Marcellus got a triumph for his efforts, for whatever reason, Scipio Calvus, who actually ended the war, did not receive a triumph, thus creating a pattern of him not receiving enough credit for his actions. In late 219 or very early 218, Hannibal rejected Rome's ultimatum to back off of the siege of Saguntum, and thus the Second Punic War began in earnest. The consuls for 218 had already been elected, and one of them was Scipio Calvus's younger brother Publius. Publius Cornelius Scipio was tasked with leading a 22,000-man army into Spain to establish a base of operations and begin to threaten the operation of the Barcids in Spain. The Barcids, by the way, are the family of Hannibal. Had Hannibal actually remained in Spain, this force would have been woefully inadequate in terms of numbers. When Hannibal eventually marched to Italy, he brought with him some 60,000 men, and he did not necessarily leave behind a tiny force. He ended up having to leave behind many of his men along the way. He also took some casualties. So when he got to Italy, he was down to maybe 26,000 or so. But still, had he kept that original force he started out with, then the 22,000-man army under the Scipios would not have done all that much. The basic idea behind Scipio's assignment was to establish a Roman base of operations north of the river Ebro, an area the Carthaginians had not reached yet, and hopefully would not reach for some time, as it was about 100 miles or so to the north of Saguntum, if not more. However, as events unfolded and it became clear that Hannibal was planning to go elsewhere, Calvus would end up being the only Scipio to command this force in the capacity as a senior legate. As his brother's senior legate, and as a man who had won some military distinction, Scipio Calvus no doubt helped a great deal when it came to organizing and training the men, and he was present at Massalia when the two brothers learned that Hannibal was to their north and about to cross the Alps into northern Italy. When they received the news, Scipio the consul decided that this was a serious enough crisis that it would warrant the presence of a Roman consul. However, he did not want to abandon his mission, which he saw as strategically vital, that is, taking the war to Carthage's stronghold. So what he decided to do was to send his brother Scipio Calvus ahead to Spain with a 22,000-man army, while he would go back to Italy, combine the Praetorian armies that were there, raise some fresh troops, and then confront Hannibal in the north with that force. This was probably the correct strategic decision, and Publius deserves a great deal of credit for this, although it must be said that had his senior legate been anyone else, especially anyone more junior than Scipio Calvus, it is highly unlikely that Publius would have made this same decision. So a great deal of credit also goes to Scipio Calvus for being someone who was clearly able to do such a thing. When Scipio Calvus arrived in northern Spain, he found that Hannibal had left a general named Hanno in the area with 10,000 infantry and about 1,000 cavalry. The idea here was to keep the lines of communication between Hannibal and Italy and his stronghold in Spain open. So this was a wise decision on Hannibal's part, and it would begin to pay off now that the Romans had to fight an enemy force upon landing. It is worth noting, as we'll see later, that most of the Spanish tribes were pretty hostile to the Carthaginians outside of the coastal areas that they had more fully pacified. Once he arrived in this area, Scipio Calvus, for his part, desired a quick victory. He had to establish a beachhead after all, and he needed to gain some control of the coast and also move into the hinterlands to make sure that he kept supplies and raised money from the locals. For his part, Hanno knew that the best and most sure way to defeat Scipio would be to beat him early and to prevent him from establishing himself in Spain. At this time, the great victories of Hannibal had not occurred, and it would be natural for Hanno and other Carthaginians to assume that the Romans would just keep pouring men into the area from their vast manpower pools back in Italy. So both commanders sought a quick victory. It might seem foolish for Hanno to want an engagement with such a larger army, but there is some strategic reason for it. So the two armies ended up fighting a field battle near the city of Cissa, and Scipio Calvus, who had a massive advantage and was also a skilled general, was able to win pretty handily. Hanno and some 2,000 of his men were captured, and their 6,000 were killed in action, and I suppose another 2,000 must have, 2 or 3,000 must have been running for the hills. After Cissa fell, and also the army camp under Hanno fell, Scipio Calvus learned that he had won a great prize. At this place, it turns out that Hannibal's army had gotten rid of a lot of its extra baggage, and it had been stored here for safekeeping. So this probably was not welcome news to Hannibal's men in Italy, but even if they did receive it, it doesn't seem like it hurt their morale too much as they continued to fight extremely well against the Romans in Italy. After his victory at Cissa over Hanno, Scipio Calvus then took some time to make a relationship with the local tribes along the coast to ensure that they would remain placid, and after he had established a base, he decided to take out his fleet and find the Carthaginian navy. The idea here was to establish naval supremacy as quickly as possible. His fleet gave him mobility, and if he could ensure that the Carthaginian fleet was disabled, then this would mean that he would have the edge in mobility throughout the campaign. The Carthaginians did not have a particularly big fleet going into the Second Punic War, but certainly they had more ships than they were supposed to have based on the Treaty of 241. That being said, that treaty had effectively expired once the Carthaginians paid off their war debt, so they weren't necessarily in violation of the treaty, but still a lot of the ships they did have were new and their crews were relatively inexperienced. Most of that Punic naval tradition had been lost due to years of inactivity. When he did find Himilco's fleet, and Himilco is effectively the admiral of Hasdrubal Barca, the younger brother of Hannibal, and commander-in-chief for Spain. When he found this fleet, it was under the command of a man named Himilco, and it was more or less at anchor or beached at the mouth of the Ebro. He managed to catch them by surprise, and he managed to capture or sink 30 out of the 40 ships. In Livy's account, which he actually dates to the spring of 217, so after some other land actions, this is a very humiliating defeat for the Carthaginians. In fact, Livy lays it on so thick that I don't find it to be a credible account of the battle at all. Basically what happened in Livy's account is that they noticed the Romans sailing up, and the first person to notice, or one of the first people, was Hasdrubal himself. So he rode his horse down to where the crews were, and he was shouting at them to get back in their boats and do what they're supposed to do. And the crews were so disheartened that they were just scrambling all over each other and fumbling about and knocking into each other. And even though they got their ships into the water, they realized that they would not be able to deploy in time. So they basically just bailed from the ships, swam back to shore, and just watched their ships get towed off. Now, I'm not saying that this account is necessarily 100% wrong. I don't know. But it seems a little far-fetched. I doubt that even if they were relatively green sailors, that they were that bad. Because that's just other next level terrible. So, but again, Livy's a great storyteller, so I thought I'd share that. Speaking of our good friend Titus Livius, let's now turn to Livy's account of what Hasdrubal was up to at this time and what Scipio Calvus had to do in response. This is not found in the narrative of Polybius, so it is possible that it didn't happen. Nonetheless, he must have gotten it from somewhere, and it does make for a great story, as is often the case with Livy. Hasdrubal was on the way north with about 9,000 men, hoping to join Hanno, but then he learned about what happened at Cissa, so he decided that he could not really risk battle against Scipio Calvus with a force half the size. What he did instead was to try to hit Scipio's naval crews, so he struck at the city of Terrico, where a lot of them were hanging out, and while he did not really do a ton of damage to the fleet, he apparently did harass them enough to piss off Scipio Calvus, who really chided them for their conduct. He then marched into the hinterlands and sparked a revolt among the Ilergetes. This is a tribe which had recently surrendered to the Romans and whose loyalty was a bit on the low side. When he heard that Scipio Calvus was coming out of winter quarters in order to deal with the mischief that he was trying to sow north of the Ebro, Hasdrubal decided to retreat to the south and leave the Celtiberians to their own devices. One of the reasons why this account doesn't quite work is that we don't really know how or why Scipio's fleet would be hanging out at Terrico. But otherwise, this isn't inherently impossible. Emerging from winter quarters, Scipio Calvus advanced against the Ilergetes, laying siege to their capital and ultimately compelling them to yield even more hostages and return to the Roman fold. I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but the standard operating procedure for both the Roman and Carthaginian armies operating in Spain was to ensure the loyalty of the various Celtiberian tribes by forcing them to yield hostages and then holding those hostages as insurance in case that tribe decided to turn traitor. This strategy was surprisingly not as effective as you might think, given that a lot of the hostages were the children of prominent citizens. A lot of times that was not enough to keep these tribes in line. After he had defeated the Ilergetes, Calvus decided to stay in the field and marched to the Ebro itself to fight the tribe, the Occitani, who had also revolted, probably with Hasdrubal's gold. Hasdrubal, as we'll see, was extraordinarily effective at sowing dissent and winning allies by distributing money. In many ways, you can think of him as the paymaster of the entire Carthaginian military after Hannibal leaves Spain. This operation got interrupted, however, by an attack from the Occitani, who were trying to relieve the siege that Scipio was laying against the Occitani. So when he learned that the Occitani were advancing, Scipio Calvus decided to set up some of his men in ambush along the route that they were taking, and then he caught them unprepared and inflicted about 12,000 or so losses on their force. He then returned to lay siege to the Occitani, and Livy tells us that this was a siege where both sides were suffering from snow. After 30 days, the Occitani surrendered. And it is worth noting that everything that I just told you came directly from Livy, and also that most of it is generally not included in most accounts of the Second Punic War because Livy's details are often dismissed. In order to defeat the Occitani, the Occitani, and the first tribe that Scipio marched against, this required his full force and his full attention. Hasdrubal used this distraction in order to march against some of Scipio's other allies who were not as easily reached. Therefore, Scipio Calvus had to resort to calling upon his allies to band together in order to drive back Hasdrubal. These allies remained loyal, and they worked together and succeeded in throwing back Hasdrubal with heavy losses. Livy says 15,000 casualties, and then followed up their success by attacking 3 towns which had been aligned with Hasdrubal and capturing them for the pro-Roman cause. All the details I just gave you, as before, are from Livy, and in this case, this part sounds like pure fantasy, largely because of the massive number of casualties that Hasdrubal suffered without a Roman force being present. It just doesn't quite add up, and it just seems a little too good to be true. I mentioned earlier that when the Romans first arrived, they found that the local Celtiberian tribes were already thoroughly sick of the Carthaginians, especially the wars the Carthaginians brought to them and the heavy taxes that they imposed. A lot of Celtiberians were effectively enslaved in Carthaginian mines in the south, and they felt that their freedoms were being taken away by the Carthaginians who were trying to carve out a land empire in Iberia. The Romans, therefore, they greeted as liberators, not knowing that the Romans aimed to take those mines and operate them for themselves. But that would come later. For now, the Celtiberians were quite happy to see the Romans. I could not find a great map which shows the foothold that the Scipio brothers established, but just imagine sort of the upper part of Hispania Citerior as the base of operations that Scipio Calvus has been establishing. This would become the key achievement of his tenure in Spain. And by establishing Roman leadership north of the Ebro, he really set the stage for all of the future successes that the Romans had. Even after the Second Punic War, when the Romans would spend the next 200 years in fits and starts conquering the rest of the Iberian Peninsula, it was this area which was really their staging area, where they would organize their armies and then depart. So this is a very significant achievement. Also, the way that he did all of this was through a combination of extensive hostage taking. So he would arrive at a place and say, unless you yield some hostages and align with me, bad things will happen. He also engaged in diplomacy with tribes that were deeper inland, who he could not quite reach, and a lot of them were happy to work with him because they hated the Carthaginians more. He also did some outright campaigning, so some people refused to yield hostages and had to be persuaded by force rather than merely the threat of force. So his diplomacy was diplomacy with a sword, and he was pretty damn adept at doing it. Back in Italy, Publius Scipio had been defeated at Ticinus, and he had then been prorogued for 217, and along with his brother, who was also named Proconsul, he was sent out to formally command in Spain. When he arrived in 217, at some point in the spring, he brought with him some 8,000 additional men and some additional supplies. Interestingly enough, this 8,000 man influx of reinforcements would be, to the best of my knowledge, the last major body of men sent from Italy to Spain until Scipio Africanus arrived in 211. The two brothers worked together as proconsuls. They were approximately equal, or at least legally equal, but Scipio Calvus clearly had more military talent, and he was also the older of the two siblings, so for the most part it would appear that he was calling the shots. It seems that a lot of people just kind of assume lazily, modern people I mean, that Publius must have been the more senior Scipio because it had been his consulship before all of this, and he'd been the one assigned to Spain originally, and also that his son is Scipio Africanus. But it really, if you look at the details here, it's very clear who is the senior partner. Calvus operates mostly on land. Land operations were vastly more important, especially in the Roman mind, but also just in the context of this war where Carthage doesn't really have that much of a fleet. Publius Scipio will command at sea, meaning that he is taking up the smaller task, the task of less importance. And this will be effectively how they do things for most of their tenure together. Both of them will engage in diplomacy and strategy, so it's not really clear which of them is coming up with ideas, but based on what we've seen already from Scipio Calvus, nothing that happens after this point will be in contradiction to what he has done already. So I have to assume that either the two of them agreed on everything, or else Scipio Calvus was basically just calling the shots. The strategy that the Scipio brothers pursued was effectively to do what Hannibal wanted to do in Italy, but in reverse. Famously, Hannibal wanted to go into Italy and break up Rome's hold over its allies, to play up the resentments that his allies had about their inferior status and break up Rome's control of the Italian peninsula. The difference here is that Barcid Spain was very new. Hamilcar, the founder, had only arrived in the 230s, and most of the tribes had not been assimilated in any way, and they were still very resentful. A lot of Rome's allies were more or less content with their status, and it took a fair amount of prodding, bribery, and chicanery to get some of them to revolt, even after some of the major defeats. So the task facing the Scipio brothers in terms of winning local allies was a great deal easier. Barcid Spain was infinitely more fragile than Roman Italy. That being said, the Celtiberian tribes were deeply distrustful of outsiders, and their loyalty did not go much deeper than what you could purchase for any given campaign. And we'll see that it was that slipperiness on the part of the Celtiberians, who again were not looking to be puppets of either Rome or Carthage, which would ultimately cost both Scipio brothers their lives. After Lake Trasimene and Cannae in 217 and 216 respectively, resources and reinforcements would become a lot more limited, and the two brothers were tasked with holding the line and preventing any more additional Carthaginian forces from reaching Hannibal. They had to do this on a shoestring, where they had to raise all of their money and additional manpower locally. And by the way, as they're trying to make friends with the Spanish and pose as liberators, this need for more money means that they have to tax the locals and undermine their own popularity to do their job. So what they do here changes pretty rapidly after Hannibal really starts to kick ass in Italy. And now, ladies and gentlemen, story time with Livy. The Scipio brothers learned that all of the hostages that Hannibal had taken prior to his departure from Spain were being held at Saguntum. As we talked about, Saguntum is not very deep in Carthaginian territory, as it was not all that far from the Ebro. And when I say all that far, we're talking 100 or more miles, but when compared with Carthago Nova, Gadir, and some of the other cities that were core parts of Punic Spain, this was not a deep operation on the part of the Scipios to reach this place. So they decided that the best move they could possibly make in 217 would be to march on Saguntum and free all the hostages in order to unravel Hannibal and Hasdrubal's coalition at a blow. After all, the Carthaginians were ruling more or less purely through fear and recruiting men purely through pay, and without the fear of having their relatives slain, a lot of the tribes would prefer to work with Rome, which was the new kid on the block, and up to this point had not really imposed any taxes or invaded their territories. Before they could arrive, however, one of the Spaniards named Abalix went up to the garrison commander, a Carthaginian named Bostar, and told him that the best way for Carthage to win the war in the long run would be to win the goodwill of the Celtiberian tribes. And the best way to win their trust is to first demonstrate Punic trust in them. So he persuaded Bostar to release all of the hostages voluntarily in order to win that goodwill. They had an elaborate plan where, because Bostar knew that his fellow Carthaginians would think of this very negatively, so they arranged to secretly release the hostages at night, and Abalix said he would lead them home and make sure that they spread the good news about how great the Carthaginians are. But instead, Abalix had been working with the Scipios. At some point, they'd come into contact, and he led the hostages straight into Scipio's camp. Now, the hostages, who were pretty much all the sons of noblemen, met with the Scipio brothers and formed friendship, and then went home and said that their release was due to the Romans. Apparently, they were not told that they were released, and so for them, it appeared that Abalix had been working for the Romans, and then the Romans had been responsible for getting them out of there. We don't hear of Bostar again, but I have to imagine that he must have been executed for doing something this idiotic. And spoiler alert, when we eventually do a tier ranking video of the Carthaginian commanders of the Second Punic War, he will not be in the S tier. What this move did was to force Hasdrubal onto the defensive, and now Carthage was forced to send reinforcements. Hannibal had been expecting reinforcements in Italy proper, but instead the Carthaginians needed them because now they had to fight the tribes harder, collect new hostages, and worry about more than just the army under the two Scipios. Going into 216, both the Carthaginians and the Romans were well aware of Lake Trasimene. For the Scipio brothers, they were now under pressure to win a victory in Spain, which would hopefully help to restore morale and also distract from what was going on in Italy. They thought maybe if they won a decisive battle against Hasdrubal Barca, that this would force the Carthaginians to send more men to Spain, and Hannibal himself might still be compelled to leave Italy. They didn't seem to know Hannibal very well at this point. Hasdrubal, however, for his part, was not really ready for battle. He had been disappointed in his men's performance, and so he didn't really have a lot of confidence in their ability to win a battle or to be loyal. His idea was to wait for reinforcements from Africa, which did in fact come, and the importance of these reinforcements is not so much that they were inherently better than his Iberian troops, but rather that they were much more loyal. Remember, Hasdrubal is relying very heavily upon Celtiberian mercenaries, and while they usually will fight as long as they're being paid, and Hasdrubal had deep pockets, he did need a core of men who were loyal, that he could rely upon battle after battle, and who could be trusted. So now that he has his core in place, he decides to go fight the Scipii, but then he learns that the Tartesii in his own territory are revolting. So he has to deal with the rebellion closer to home before he can go out to fight the Romans, and ultimately 216 more or less ends, the campaigning season that is, without him engaging the two Scipio brothers. One of his main goals is to hold on to all of the mining areas in the south, as this is the place where the Carthaginians are producing most of their wealth at this point. Then he receives a special set of orders from Carthage, probably in the late fall. These orders are for him to immediately mobilize his army and head to Italy. In the wake of Cannae, which occurred in August, the Carthaginian Senate, which had been more or less hostile to the efforts of Hannibal, or at least somewhat lukewarm, were now very much into reinforcing him in Italy and trying to end the war immediately. It's amazing how success can really change people's minds. However, this order would end up being counterproductive as it quickly leaked out, and it turns out that many of the Iberian troops, who were the majority of Hasdrubal's men, were not happy about the prospect of leaving Iberia while there was a Roman army operating there. So many of the men were disheartened, and many of the tribes loyal to Carthage felt that Hasdrubal would depart any day and leave them to the Romans, so they decided to revolt and join the Romans. Hasdrubal obviously could not leave. And as we look at the Carthaginian politics which led to Hasdrubal's ultimate attempt to escape from Spain in 215, we run into another source contradiction. According to Livy, Hasdrubal wrote back to Carthage and said that they needed to send a replacement for him before he could depart, as the area would need an experienced and able commander-in-chief. Right now, he did not have anybody who met that description. So accordingly, they supposedly sent Himilco with some more reinforcements, and then Hasdrubal started on his merry way. Polybius doesn't really provide us with a lot of details on how this worked, but we do know that later in the year, an army which was being raised under Hannibal's brother Mago, the youngest of the Barca brothers, was sent to Spain rather than Italy, although this seems to be in response to a battle we're about to talk about in a little while. So it is possible that Livy messed up here and confused Himilco with Mago somehow. Also, I have to assume that this is not the same Himilco who was commanding the fleet earlier, although hell, who knows, maybe it was. Carthaginians are confusing in this war because they rarely, if ever, mention the name of the father or any kind of surname. Anyhow, the idea was that Himilco would arrive and take overall command of Punic Spain, thus freeing Hasdrubal to march north and go to Italy to help his brother. If he had arrived in 215 with another full army, then obviously Hannibal, who was still around the peak of his strength and starting to gain more allies in central and southern Italy, would have been in an excellent position to potentially attempt an assault on Rome or something of that nature. But as he was making his preparations, the Scipio brothers decided that priority number one absolutely had to be preventing Hasdrubal from leaving Spain. They did not want him to cross the Pyrenees, and this was their overarching priority. Most likely, they also received direct orders from the Senate to this exact tune as well. The brothers decided to draw out Hasdrubal and defeat him, so their first move was to lay siege to a wealthy city called Hybera, The idea being that if they took the city, it would be a major blow to the Carthaginians and they'd be forced to come out and defend it. But instead, they learned that Hasdrubal was trying to bypass them and that he was busy trying to take a city somewhere else, so they broke off their siege and pursued him. Marching back toward the Ebro and their own home base, they located Hasdrubal at the city of either Ibera or Dertosa, and here they engaged him. He was trying to slip across the Ebro River and then march through their province, and thence through the Pyrenees and through Gaul, through the Alps, and then into Italy. But he didn't get very far. He didn't even get in the Roman territory. At Dertosa, both armies were of approximately equal strength, at about 25,000 men, give or take. Hasdrubal had apparently heard a great deal about his brother's victory the previous year at Cannae, and he tried to replicate Cannae. His job should have been a good deal easier than what Hannibal pulled off, since Hannibal pulled off a double envelopment against a superior force that had him outnumbered by as much as 2-to-1, whereas Hasdrubal's trying to do it with a 1-to-1 numerical equality. However, unlike at Cannae and most of the battles that Hannibal fought, it would appear that the cavalry that was left behind for Hasdrubal and the others in Iberia was not nearly as good as what Hannibal had taken with him. So although he did have an edge in the quality and quantity of his horsemen, they were not able to make the Romans budge. So the Roman cavalry held their ground, and then the Roman infantry carried the center. So effectively this would have been as if the Romans under the two consuls, Varro and Paulus, had managed to hold their ground, and then the Roman center under the proconsuls had smashed Hannibal's army. That's basically what happens at Dertosa. It is a less than impressive attempt at pulling off Cannae 2.0. Hasdrubal's army was heavily damaged, but he escaped with most of his mounted forces to Carthago Nova, and since most of his mounted troops are the guys he's getting from Africa, especially the Numidians, and since most of his infantry are the hired Celtiberians, this is not as bad of a defeat as it seems. Also, it would appear that his elephants escaped as well, so he didn't lose anything that he couldn't replace, but it's still a pretty big moment. Of all of the victories in 215, and there are several key victories, this was perhaps the biggest in terms of scale, and it may have been the one which most bolstered Roman morale. Although Scipio Calvus's victory at Dertosa was one of the key elements in denying Hannibal the momentum that he needed to make the best use of Cannae, the fact is that Cannae still did a great deal of damage to Rome's war effort, and it put a massive strain on Rome's resources. After Cannae, and despite their own best efforts, the Scipio brothers were forced to more or less operate completely independently. They raised all of their money for their operations locally. And as I mentioned, the problem with that is that they're trying to win the friendship of these tribes, and yet they're forced to resort to the same tactics the Carthaginians are using in order to raise money. So they are now no longer acting as a more generous and less oppressive people. They did, however, need more equipment. Military equipment breaks down, and apparently it is very hard to produce locally. At least it was at this time. The more professional legions of later years would have blacksmiths attached to them, and they'd also have base camps where they could produce new gear. At this point, however, there was nothing of the sort with the army in Spain. So the Scipio brothers had to write back to the Senate to request that they send more equipment to replace things that had broken. The Senate was more or less flat broke itself, so they had to actually take out a special loan from wealthy individuals in order to finance the building and shipping of a bunch of equipment. Increasingly, starting in a couple of years, the Scipio brothers would start to run low on Roman troops, and they would have to get more creative and start to use their own Celtiberian auxiliaries and ultimately mercenaries. The cost of defeat, therefore, when they could not count on any reinforcements, was far too high to make many risk. So what the Scipio brothers did was to prefer small-scale actions to support revolts, and to generally kind of go with a creeping advance by winning new allies and then backing them up cautiously. So they were still advancing to the south of the Ebro, but their progress was not rapid, and the reason for that is because they cannot take big risk right now since they are operating at the end of a tether. When it comes to the operations of the Scipio brothers in 214, we learn everything that we know from Livy, but in this case his account seems to me at least to be fairly plausible. So let's talk about what he has to say. In early 214, the Barca brothers, that is Hasdrubal and Mago, who was now in Spain, won a major victory over the natives and had the allies of Rome in further Spain, that is Spain at this point beyond the Ebro, on the ropes. A lot of them were considering giving in to Carthage and thus undoing all the progress that the Scipio brothers had done in the wake of the victory at Dertosa. Publius Scipio was the first to get his men mobilized. He probably used the ships, and he moved in as quickly as possible in order to show support and try to prevent the allies from defecting. But he was quickly forced to fall back to a fortified camp and await his brother. As the two forces converged, Publius then went ahead to scout, but his troops were detected by the enemy, who again were superior in terms of cavalry and scouting, and he quickly found himself surrounded on a hillock. He was about to be slain and overran, but then his brother Scipio Calvus arrived and rescued him. So once again we get a story which shows that clearly one of the brothers is significantly better at military affairs than the other. In 214, when the Scipio brothers approached Castulo, the city defected to the Romans, and this created a bit of a crisis for the Carthaginians since their grand campaign for the year had come unraveled, and they were now on the back foot, losing ground to the Romans. So what they decided to do was to try to shift momentum by marching north to the Ebro and attacking Dertosa, which was just to the south. Dertosa had been quite a prize for the Scipios the year before, and as you might imagine, they were alarmed at the prospect of losing it. It was, after all, the doorstep to the Roman stronghold to the north of the river. So Scipio Calvus was quite alarmed by this development. He took a legion north without baggage so they could move more quickly, and he got into the city by marching between the two camps of Mago and Hasdrubal, and then entering the city. When he came in, he apparently was able to inflict heavy losses. I assume this means that there were men out foraging who were caught unprepared. The next day, he rallied the garrison and began to sally out, inflicting heavy losses and forcing the Carthaginians to fall back. Supposedly, he inflicted 12,000 losses, but when it comes to loss numbers, Livy tends to like to use big numbers, so I would not take that part too seriously. Suffice it to say that he showed that the siege of Dertosa was not going to happen. Not long after this, he rallied his unit and then went after another Carthaginian force laying siege at Bagheera. So earlier I mentioned that one of the reasons to be skeptical of Livy's account is geography, and just for context, if you'll recall, Castulo is fairly far south, so it would be pretty deep in Carthaginian-held territory. So Scipio Calvus marched all the way there, then doubled back all the way to the Ebro, and now he's going to plunge into the heart of Carthaginian Spain and fight a battle at Munda, which, yes, is the same place that Caesar later fought Sextus Pompeius. Munda, as you can see on the map, is deep, deep in the south of Spain, and this would not have been far from Gades, which at the time was Gadir, another major Carthaginian city. So this was literally taking the fight to the front door of the Carthaginians. According to Livy, however, Scipio Calvus got his army all the way back to Munda after having marched all the way back to the Ebro, and this is all still in 214. Here at Munda, he squared off with a Punic army. This battle was long and hard fought. After 4 hours of very competitive fighting, the Romans were on the cusp of victory. Some of the Carthaginian formations had more or less quit the field and were on the verge of breaking, but then the Romans sounded the retreat and fell back to camp. There was some confusion, and then people learned that the reason for their retreat was that Scipio Calvus had been wounded badly by a javelin. Although the Carthaginian army retired in good order to the nearby city of Auringis and then had a respite which could have been anywhere from weeks to months, Calvus was very much eager to renew the struggle as a direct attack on the fortified city and army stationed at Auringis. And during that respite, the Carthaginians were able to make good most of their losses. So again, we have Scipio Calvus, who, as we mentioned, is operating under some severe constraints in terms of the ability to sustain casualties, operating supposedly in the absolute heart of Punic territory. At Auringis, the armies there were commanded by the two Barca brothers, Hasdrubal and Mago. While Hasdrubal commanded the defenses, Mago went out to recruit new Celtiberian mercenaries, and as always, when you have a full coin purse, the mercenaries will show up. If you build it, they will come. If you pay, they will serve. Scipio Calvus now had recovered to some extent, but not fully, so he advanced to Auringis and commanded the battle from a stretcher. This was something that was not terribly normal in Roman history, and also something that is a somewhat suspect detail. Despite the fact that the Punic army had refilled its ranks and was holding a defensive position, and that the Romans were operating on the offensive deep within enemy territory, Scipio Calvus decided to press the assault vigorously. This mercenary army fought very well and bravely despite being newly assembled and having just suffered a fairly major defeat not long before, but ultimately Scipio Calvus and his men prevailed. We do not know the losses from this battle, but given the circumstances, if this battle is in fact real, it would seem that the Romans probably lost more men than their strategy could sustain, and this might account for the relative quiet of the Romans in the year 213. As we'll see, there's only really one thing they do in 213, and that would be in line with them having lost too many men in 214. And also, Livy claiming that they won a victory here is a little bit problematic in itself, because this is the kind of victory which apparently had no real impact, since the year after this victory, or 2 years after this victory, the Romans are advancing on a river, the Bitus, which is to the north of both Auringis and Munda. So the count doesn't quite add up. We don't know of any specific battles or campaigns taking place in Spain in 213, but it does seem pretty safe to assume that there was some fighting. It must not have been terribly important, however, as we have no real account of it in Livy's history, and Livy is nothing if not extremely detailed, even to the point of perhaps making up a detail here or there to make things sound good. We do know two things that did happen this year, however, which had a huge impact on both events of the next year, 212, the fate of the Scipio brothers, and also the war as a whole. So in 213, the Scipio brothers, who seemed to have been running low on manpower, decided to hire Celtiberians as mercenaries, in addition to siding with them as allied auxiliaries. Livy tells us that this was the very first time in Roman history that the city had employed formal mercenaries. This actually makes a good deal of sense. They didn't have that many other options. Rome was still starved for resources and manpower, and this was the only real way to try to get that. So it makes sense to me. And also, this is in line with the Scipio brothers being part of a faction which was more forward-thinking and more willing to innovate and deviate from tradition. If the Fabii had been in command in Spain, they might have tried something different. The other events that occurred this year that would prove to be very important for the war in Spain and the overall Second Punic War occurred in Numidia. Syphax Numidia was the leading prince in the west, and he had been a Carthaginian ally and one of the chief suppliers of men to the Carthaginian army. However, secretly he wished to be free of Carthaginian dominion, and he knew that the chief ally that he could potentially find would be the Romans. So in 213, this was the year that he decided to turn against the Carthaginians, and he started negotiating directly with the Scipio brothers. So they had something of an officer exchange, where one of the legates under the Scipios went to Numidia to train the infantry, because Numidia did not have much of an infantry tradition. They became fairly proficient under the guidance of this legate. In exchange, Syphax sent a few noblemen to Spain so that they could speak to the Numidians in the Carthaginian army and urge them to defect. Both elements of the arrangement proved to be effective, as the men, when they learned that Syphax, their prince, was now anti-Carthage, defected. So now the Carthaginians were losing their most effective unit, and the Scipio brothers were getting some Numidians on their side. In Africa, however, the Carthaginians decided to respond by punishing Syphax. And they did this by turning to a tribe of eastern Numidians. This tribe was under an older king, but he had a young son named Massinissa, who at this time was only about 17 years old. Yet, despite his youth, he was a man of extraordinary ability, and he would quickly inflict two major defeats on Syphax, who would take years to recover from these defeats. And after he declared himself to be the new ruler of Numidia, a kingdom which would not formally get underway until after the war, he then left with a large force to reinforce the Barcas and arrived in Spain by 212. So events taking place outside of Spain would ultimately decide the fate of the Spanish War, at least in its first phase. In 212, the Scipio brothers decided to renew their offensive against the Barcids. They agreed that the number one priority for their efforts should be Hasdrubal's army, since he was the commander-in-chief, and defeating him would do more to undermine enemy morale than defeating Mago or one of the other generals in the area, Hasdrubal, son of Gisco. However, they feared that if they beat him too early in the campaign, that Mago and Hasdrubal, son of Gisco, would retreat to the interior and become harder to reach. So they decided that the best way to avoid such a fate would be to defeat both Barca brothers at once, and then capitalize on those victories by seizing some territory. So this was literally a case where Rome and Carthage were both entrusting their armies to two pairs of brothers who are now squaring off. You want to talk about the real twin dragons? It occurred in 212 in Spain. So the plan was for Scipio Calvus to take 1/3 of the Romans along with pretty much all of the Celtiberian mercenaries and seek out Hasdrubal, while his brother Publius left with the other 2/3 of the Romans to face Mago. Exactly how much scouting they did before this, or how aware they were of the whereabouts of the Carthaginians, I cannot say, but this does not seem to have been a very good strategy, especially since one part of the strategy was entrusting a field battle to Publius Scipio. They fought 2 battles, and then there was a long pursuit. This collectively is called the battle or battles on the Upper Bitus, but really this was more of a campaign, and it would end up lasting for about 30 days in total from beginning to end. Scipio Calvus managed to locate Hasdrubal before his brother found Mago, but Hasdrubal refused to engage him, and we'll come back to that in a minute. In the meantime, Publius Scipio would meet his end. Massinissa and his Numidians were now with Mago's army. Mago's army was more on the interior, Hasdrubal was closer to the coast, and the Numidians under a capable leader were very dangerous. Scipio had a lot of trouble moving around, his men were being harassed constantly, and because his movements were hampered, this allowed the Third Army in Spain under Hasdrubal, son of Gisco, to arrive, and basically what Mago was planning was a complete encirclement and destruction of Scipio's army. Another Celtiberian force loyal to the Carthaginians under the command of Indibulus, one of the Celtic chieftains who kept coming back again and again to fight the Romans, was on the way. So Scipio's plan was to fight his way out by attacking Indibulus, who had the smallest and weakest of these forces, and then to retreat. However, Indibulus proved to be more skillful than usual, and he held out long enough for the other troops to come up. Not surprisingly, the first force to arrive was Massinissa Numidian troops, and then Mago and Hasdrubal, son of Gisgo, came up, and ultimately Scipio died fighting. So he died in action. Some of his troops under the command of one of his legates, Tiberius Fonteius, managed to retreat, and they ran all the way back to the Ebro. Apparently, Fonteius did not manage to send a successful messenger to the camp of Scipio Calvus, because Scipio Calvus, as we'll see, for a long time was unaware of his brother's fate. In that sense, this story reminds me of the story of how Hasdrubal would later die, and Hannibal would only find out when his brother's head was thrown over the gate. Although, of course, it's not so dramatic, and we don't actually learn in the narrative of Livy whether Scipio Calvus ever did learn for sure about the fate of his brother. Earlier I misspoke slightly. I said that Scipio Calvus and Hasdrubal were on the coast. Actually, Alorca, where they were located, was still inland, just not as far inland as wherever Mago and Publius Scipio were. At any rate, when Hasdrubal saw Scipio Calvus march up, he decided to refuse battle and stick to his fortifications. There were a couple reasons for doing so. One is that Scipio Calvus was a proven commander. The other is that Hasdrubal Barca had an asset that he knew would come in more handy than the swords in his men's hands, and that was his very deep coin purse. He noticed that Scipio Calvus was relying very heavily on Celtiberians, and he knew firsthand all too well how fickle they could be when it came to issues of pay. While Scipio Calvus seems to have been a man who could inspire loyalty, at a certain point, money talks. So while he was delaying and denying Scipio battle, he began to negotiate with the Celtiberians. And he eventually induced them to desert by paying them enough wages for a full campaign. So rather than having to fight a couple more battles and campaign for the rest of the summer and possibly into the fall, the Celtiberians were able to go home that day with all the pay that they would have gotten for the next few months. It was effectively a buyout. It appears that Hasdrubal's original goal was to get them to not only desert, but also switch sides and possibly betray the camp or attack the Romans, but the Celtiberian chieftains had enough respect for Scipio Calvus they refused to do that outright. They thought that it wasn't quite betrayal if they didn't technically raise their swords against the Romans, or at least that's the explanation that Livy attributes to them. Scipio Calvus, naturally enough, was alarmed when the Celtiberians, who were the majority of his force, melted away, and he wisely decided that he would have to retreat to the Ebro. At this point, he must have started to worry about his brother, as he realized that things were taking a bad turn, and that the majority of the army was under his brother, who by this point he must have realized was not the greatest commander in the world. Shortly after they had crushed the army of Publius Scipio, Mago, Hasdrubal, and Massinissa started marching east to link up with Hasdrubal. They arrived right as Scipio Calvus was breaking camp and moving north. And at this point, he's really wondering where the hell his brother's at. And Livy's wording suggests that it wasn't so much that he was worried about his brother's well-being, as that he assumed that the enemy had given his brother the slip, and that he was somewhat frustrated with his brother's incompetence. It's not entirely clear when or if Calvus learned of his brother's fate, and as I said earlier, there's no indication that Calvus had any contact with Tiberius Fonteius, or at least enough contact for him to fully learn the fate of his brother. When they do interact later in the story, it's not entirely clear if they had time to exchange any greetings or communications. Now, one thing to keep in mind about Scipio Calvus's force is that while it is vastly outnumbered by the enemy, it is a small force of seasoned soldiers, so these are veteran marchers, and without an overwhelming enemy cavalry presence, it would not be that hard to slip away. He could probably march by night and march rapidly, and his men would be able to march through pretty much any area because they are a lean, mean fighting machine. But the problem is that the Numidians are here, and they're under the greatest Numidian of the war. Yes, greater than Maharbal, that would be Massinissa. And Massinissa was still young and on the make, and he was very eager to make a name for himself, so he was hounding the Romans every step of the way. Just as he had done against Publius Scipio, Massinissa decided to hound every step that Scipio Calvus and his men took, thus greatly slowing their progress. Every step of the way they had to fight their way through the Numidians. The Numidians were light cavalrymen who threw javelins and were extremely skilled riders, so the Romans were being exhausted and taking losses. They were delayed so much because they had to move with caution that the Punic infantry arrived hot on their tails, and Scipio Calvus was forced to try to find a defensible piece of ground before he was forced to fight an infantry action. The only piece of high ground that he could find was not very high, but also not suitable for fortification, so it was the worst of all worlds. He effectively got deeply unlucky at a pivotal moment. Had he found a better hill that was more easily dug into, or that was just simply more naturally steep, things might have gone differently. But as it is, he found one of the most useless hillocks from a military perspective that one can imagine. The ground was too stony to fortify, so his men's tools would not dig through it, but it was also not steep enough to really impede an attacking enemy. So Calvus's men had no choice but to use their baggage to erect a makeshift palisade. And of course, a big bag is no substitute for a good trench or a wooden barrier or anything like that. And in general, it was kind of disheartening because this meant that they had to put all of their supplies out front rather than in the middle. So it meant that a lot of their stuff, including the things they needed to live, might be destroyed or stolen in the midst of a battle. Soon afterwards, the Carthaginians decided to assault the camp, and given their immense numerical superiority and the weakness of Calvus's position, they quickly carried the camp. According to Livy, there are two versions of how Scipio Calvus died. Polybius tells us simply that he died when his camp was assaulted, and that is the version that Livy mostly goes with, although he does say that there's an alternative version in circulation that has Scipio Calvus breaking out with a handful of his men and then entering Fonteius's camp as refugees with the Carthaginians hot on their tails. And as the Carthaginians are trying to storm the camp, he ends up in one of the towers trying to defend it, and then the enemy sets fire to one of the watchtowers. He's trapped inside and burns to death. But that story, while it does sound pretty amazing, is a little hard to believe, although I kind of like it, so I'll just say that's how Scipio Calvus died. In a watchtower where the door jammed and it caught on fire. And maybe, just maybe, he had a chance to talk to Tiberius Fonteius for just a minute and learn that his brother had perished and that most of his force had been destroyed. So, there you go. Scipio Calvus is now dead. Let's talk about his legacy, which I think is pretty underrated. As I see it, Scipio Calvus had two legacies. One was being one of the better generals in the Second Punic War, and the other was founding a new and successful branch of the Scipii. When it comes to his military skills, I think that I've made a pretty compelling case in this video, that he was, in fact, a very good commander. He had strategic skills, he was also very good at battlefield command, he had rapport with his men, and he was very diplomatically gifted. He was one of the very few Romans of this time, or really any time, who had all of the skills one would need to be an effective theater commander. Together with his brother, working with minimal resources, he managed to create a durable base for Rome in the north, and an alliance network throughout most of eastern Spain that would later enable his nephew to conquer the Barcid sections of Spain and oust the Carthaginians for good. Along with Marcus Valerius Livinus, Scipio Calvus is one of the most overlooked, important, talented, and underrated commanders of the entire war. Any list of Roman commanders, especially Roman commanders from the Republican period, which does not give at least an honorable mention to Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Calvus, is incomplete and not to be taken seriously, at least in my opinion. Livy has what I think is a fitting tribute to Scipio Calvus. This is in Book 25, Chapter 36, right after Gnaeus Scipio was killed. Quote, Gnaeus Scipio was killed in the 8th year after his arrival in Spain, and on the 29th day after his brother's death. Sorrow over the deaths of the men was not more intense in Rome than it was throughout Spain. Indeed, the grief of the citizens of Rome was partly over the destruction of the armies, the loss of a province, and of a national catastrophe, whereas in Spain it was the loss of generals themselves that people felt and regretted, and the more so in the case of Gnaeus, for he had been commander for a longer period, had won their esteem earlier than his brother, and, in addition, he had been for them the first example of Roman justice and moderation. As for the second part of Scipio Calvus's legacy, that is his descendants, you might not recognize them immediately, but he is effectively the founder of the line of Scipio Nasica. Scipio Nasica, his son, became so famous for his virtue and for being supposedly the best man of his time that even as a very young man in 205, he was significantly younger than Scipio Africanus, his cousin. He was one of the men selected to go and receive the Mother of the Gods and bring her back to Rome. Later on, he'd served as consul in 191. He had a very successful career, and his personal nickname, Nasica, which means pointed nose, would become the new family name. However, he was the son of Scipio Calvus, and that had to count for a great deal. As for why the name Calvus was not preferred, it seems pretty simple. Calvus means bald. And were baldness common within the Scipio family, it wouldn't make sense for this to be a nickname. So apparently baldness was not a super common thing among the Scipii, and this is why Scipio Calvus got his name. I didn't mention it earlier, but one of the reasons why he probably adopted the name Calvus rather than just being Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio is so that people would not confuse him with his uncle Scipio Asina, who also was named Gnaeus. Although there shouldn't have been too much confusion because his uncle had a son with the same exact name, so maybe he just wanted to make sure people knew he wasn't the Asina Scipio. Anyway, Scipio Calvus was merely more of a nickname rather than a family name, and Scipio Nasica would have a son and grandson who would also go on to do impressive things. The original Scipio Nasica, the consul in 191, was also a great jurist, so he's one of the greatest legal minds of his time. His son, Scipio Nasica Corculum, was an even greater jurist and served as Pontifex Maximus. He was one of the most famous men of his time as well. Later on, the son of Scipio Corculum was Scipio Nasica Serapio. And Scipio Nasica Serapio is most famous as being the senator who got really pissed off at Tiberius Gracchus and led the mob to murder him. So the line of Scipio Calvus was very significant for Roman history. The legal opinions of Nasica and Nasica Corculum were still in Roman law books in the time of Justinian. And as for the great-grandson of Scipio Calvus, that being Nasica Serapio, he was literally the guy who murdered Tiberius Gracchus, and according to Plutarch, there were widespread suspicions that he was murdered by the people because they loved the Gracchi brothers. So anyway, Scipio Calvus is one of the more important semi-hidden figures in Roman history who does not get discussed nearly enough, and I hope that I've gone some way towards rectifying that today. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian, and I will see you around.